So we're here this morning with Robert Paterson, the author of a fantastic ebook I wrote about last week called "You Don't Need a Job: The Rise of the Network." First, I just wanted to congratulate you, Robert, on the book and encourage folks to go to Amazon and download it ASAP. And I think, as I told you, Robert, it's probably the best encapsulation I've seen yet of some of the really profound changes regarding the nature of work that I see coming right around the corner. So I wanted to ask you, first off, is how you got the idea for the book, and how do you envision this workplace of the future?
I think the idea for the book have been growing for nearly 20 years or so. And you can see the evidence of should we say, the end of a system, or quite clearly now. You might not have been able to see that 20 years ago, but I'm not the only person who's thinking this way. And what I've tried to do in the book is to pull together many other people's rather better ideas than mine into an overall synthesis as well. Mm-hmm. But for me, it really came as a personal crisis. Nearly 20 years ago, I was the most institutional machine man you'll ever meet. I was an investment banker and the whole thing. And over a 2-year period, I started to feel like I just can't do this anymore. And I thought actually there was something wrong with me. I thought I had the problem, not the institution. And it felt so bad, in fact, that I actually went into analysis. I thought, my God, there's something really wrong with me, that I don't like the life I'm living and the machine I'm in.
Sure.
And so there came a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. And what I realized then, without knowing anything, was that what I mustn't do was to get another job.
Right.
And what I mustn't do is stay in the big city with all the expenses and everything, because I felt myself then like a donkey pulling one of those kind of bars around in a circle, And I was very well paid, and I had a big title and everything, but I was in fact a donkey. And I was just like anybody else. I was probably 3 months away from bankruptcy if I didn't get my paycheck.
Right.
And so it just started initially for me as a personal crisis. And from then on, I started to realize that maybe I wasn't the one who was mad. Maybe the system I was living in was mad. And having started my life as a historian, I then went back and started to look at things like the Reformation, where Martin Luther said, you don't need an institution to save your soul. You're in charge. And I think we're going through exactly the same kind. Everybody then was completely tied to this vast institution that occupied half the wealth of the European world and had total power over everybody, including kings. And their deal was, without the institution of the church, you were going to hell. And today we place, our livelihood, our health, our credit, our education, everything in the hands of institutions that say, without us, you can't do it.
I think that's a really interesting point, Robert. I mean, one of the points that we stress a lot at the Resilient Family is that it was, in fact, that resilience and self-reliance, and taking matters into your own hands, and not necessarily relying on institutions that that we've traditionally relied on, whether it be governments or employers or corporations or businesses or whatever. That we really have to get back to that idea of self-reliance.
Yeah, and what's different though, Coley, is that 100 or so years ago, 80% of Americans and Canadians lived in rural settings and worked in small firms, and it was largely everything was related to the food production system, right, in one way or another. And so in your small town, there was a small bank, a general store, all these things were there, but they couldn't scale, right? And what Henry Ford did was that he found a way of scaling by taking the skill out of the work and putting the skill into the design of the process. What's new? So small has always been beautiful. We've always liked working, with our friends and family. We've always liked a real face-to-face thing. But in the Henry Ford world, if you chose that, you chose poverty and hardship.
Sure.
What's new is that a network can scale better than the machine organizations. And what I think is going to happen here is we're going to have our cake and eat it. We're going to go both ways. We can have a human life, but we can also, get rewarded properly for what we're trying to do, because we're not confined just to our face-to-face village anymore.
Sure. I think what you write about industrial age systems, one of the things that I found so fascinating is that you give it, I think, a very thorough treatment of the fact that these industrial age structures really aren't working for us anymore. No. They worked reasonably well for us up to this point, but yes. Now we've reached the point of diminishing utility.
Yes.
And I guess my question is, why do you think our institutions aren't working anymore?
Because I think the world got too connected and too complex for them. And that started in around about 1985, when the web started to really happen. Mm-hmm. And it also, so remember, all these machine institutions are just that. And let's look at something like the New York Times, because it really helps us see it all. The New York Times, the main process is they've got to run the press to produce a physical paper. So that creates something called a deadline. Right. And everything serves the press, which is this great big machine.
Sure.
Press has, a work staff. It has a distribution system. Most of the costs are related to the press. And that was fine when it was the only game in town. But when Craig Newmark started Craigslist, and they took away all the ad from classified and everything, suddenly there wasn't enough revenue to keep this machine going.
Right.
So what they then do is they then have to cut their staff. And what most newspapers did, should we say the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was a great example. The Post-Dispatch was a great newspaper, but they don't have a newsroom anymore.
Right.
So they print crap. Newspapers, but they have no choice. So long as they want to have the paper, the paper drives all the costs. All these machine institutions, and the city of New York is one of them, are faced with this problem.
Sure.
That the costs of running the machine are fixed. And in a complex world where revenue is being taken away by network alternatives, they can't generate enough revenue. And in the end, they have to stop.
Go ahead.
No. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And in fact, one of the ideas that you write about is that we're actually moving into a more natural environment, or at least an environment that more approximates natural processes. And you have this really interesting idea about the concept of fractals.
Yes.
And how that concept can be integrated into the way we live on kind of a day-to-day in a day-to-day environment to help us develop kind of these more robust, resilient systems. And I was hoping you could explain that a little bit, because I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's just always interesting to look at pictures of fractals, because if you have a system that won't scale in a fractal way, it's not real.
Sure.
It's like a test. Is this system viable or not? If the smallest unit isn't the same as the largest unit, then the answer to that question is probably no. So you posted on your review 2 of my pictures, and you added another one. So there was a picture of all the neurons going in human mind. There's a picture of the universe, and there's a picture of the internet.
Right.
They're all the same. That you couldn't tell the difference between them. That shows that the inherent emergent design of the web is real.
Sure.
As opposed to a telephone network, which is not.
Right.
You know, which is a designed network. If you look at a city like Amsterdam, which grew, there's a wonderful, in Christopher Alexander's work, there's a wonderful picture of Amsterdam the first 100 years, and there's this little core on the river, and then there's another picture 400 years later, and it's all just kind of grown out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that the Dutch have a very different idea about how to protect themselves from floods than we do. And then look at Manhattan, and Manhattan is a totally machine-designed system. And you can scale it up to a certain point, but not in a healthy way. So let me just go back to then scaling, because it enables us to use networks in a highly leveraged way. For instance, people think that their network are their 3,000 friends on Facebook. How could you possibly keep up with your 3,000 friends on Facebook? It's difficult. But actually, you only have to keep up with maybe 8 friends. If you have 8 really close friends with you, the kind of friends who you say, come down and visit me in Panama, and they would come. Mm-hmm. You know who they are. You could tick them off in your mind. These people also have friends like that close, who have friends that close. So with 8, I think you reach about 4,000 people.
Right.
With that kind of trust. With 30, you reach 1.3 million by fractal. The same process that you have with 8 works with the 33.
It all scales.
Well, actually, this does scale out because you can't obtain trust as a human being with more than between 144 and 150 people. Right. Boots would be a different number. With chips, it would be a different number. There is an ideal number, and this is the work of Robin Dunbar, mm-hmm. who's really the person behind how big a group can you really feel good with. And this was all part of our hunter-gatherer past. So another part of fractaling is you've got to look at who is Coley and who's Robert. We aren't this modern man that we see either side of the video. We are the product of 4 million years of evolution,
right,
of whom the industrial and even the modern agricultural period is a flash in the pan.
Sure.
And we are most comfortable with being who we really are. And we're least comfortable in the extreme industrial world, which is where we find ourselves.
And along those lines, you wrote about the concept of status, which I thought was interesting because in an industrial machine age, right, the concept of what constitutes high status is much different than in this new environment. Yeah. And you make the observation that currently, although it's you observe that it's changing, but currently the idea of high status kind of revolves around things, cars, fancy houses, TVs, things like that, and the consequences of that are kind of a consumer-oriented society. We're over-leveraged, we're in debt, but that high status in the new world will be defined by something much different. You say it will be defined by freedom, and I was hoping you could explain that a little bit because I agree with you. I think that's exactly where we're headed.
Well, if you're a high status person, you can do what you want. If you're a slave, you have to do what you're told. And for instance, in ancient Rome, there were lots of very powerful slaves, but they were still slaves. So how the status thing changed again, when we were hunter-gatherers, all traditional societies have hierarchies. People who believe there's no hierarchy is rubbish. There are hierarchies in nature everywhere. Think of a wolf pack.
Sure.
Think of an elephant herd. There are hierarchies everywhere. The high status human hierarchy in the hunter-gatherer world were the men and women who knew the most and could guide the tribe safely through the very difficult job of raising the next generation. So they're the people who knew where the animals were, where the food was, where the water was. They knew how to heal. They were people who really knew stuff, and they basically gave to the people. Yeah, and in traditional societies, that is it. And there was no stuff because we were all moving around. You couldn't have stuff.
Right.
Might adorn your body. There was a lot of adornment in that. Well, but you couldn't. When we had agriculture and you got settled, the people who really were at the top of the hierarchy had the big castle and they wore the amazing clothes. The Duke of Buckingham changed 27 times a day when wooing the daughter of the King of France for the king. He was making a statement about how amazingly high status he was.
Right.
The problem we have today is there are, the 1% have all that money and they can have the nice cars and the whatever, and it doesn't really cost them anything. They've got the money. But with television and everything, we try and keep up with them. And everybody's got themselves into 3,500 square feet houses, Lexuses, BMWs, designer clothes, because they want to look the part. But they're fake because they've had to borrow the money to get all this.
Sure.
It's really status. So I'm saying that what I'm looking at now is that, I was one of those people. I had, the Volvos and the nice house and, beautiful clothes and everything. And it made me feel good. It did. It really did make me feel good. But actually, it came with a huge price of my being an indentured slave. I was just like any other wage earner in the system. I just had bigger expenses to match my higher salary. So I think freedom is a very important part of this. So let me make one last point here. People came to America in the 1880s. 50 million people crossed the Atlantic from about 1880 to 1912. And they came because what America offered them was a chance to be who they were, rather than being part of a feudal setup in Europe.
Sure.
We're in a new feudal setup here. The new world isn't across an ocean; it's in our minds.
It's a great point.
And the new immigrant can live next door to you, and they're in this new place where, as a networked artisan, they are a free man and a free woman, and can be who they wish to be. It's really the American dream, which is a very powerful force, reborn in a new way. But we don't have to cross an ocean to get there.
I think that's a really interesting concept, and you can see this transition happening now. I live here in Panama. I run into expats all the time here who have come from the UK, Canada, the US that are seeking something different.
Yes.
And I think at the moment they are thinking, geez, I can live anywhere on the globe that I want because I've kind of extricated myself from the machine, so to speak. But I think ultimately you're exactly right that once we reach a certain threshold, we will have that freedom, and it will be defined, I think, more by the mind than anything else. Which gets me to my last point here, which is that you suggest that there's kind of a rule of 20%.
Yes.
That is really the tipping point for these great societal transitions. And in this case, from old industrial machine systems to kind of this new networked paradigm. Can you explain why you think that 20% is the magic number?
Yeah, I don't put it out with great precision, but what I'm trying to say is you don't have to bleed the old to death for it to die.
Right.
And again, if I could come back to the New York Times, the New York Times has done, I think, a fantastic job on the web, and it is a brand leader. I've finally given up, and I've paid to subscribe to it because I miss it so much. But if you look at their earnings, they're absolutely terrible. They're getting worse all the time, and they just can't get. They've lost so much advertising revenue that their costs are bleeding them to. They haven't lost it all, but they've lost about 20 or 30%.
Sure.
And you see this in newspapers right across, and you're going to see this in television very soon. Same kind of thing. Who watches television anymore?
Right.
People do, but if you're an advertiser, they're not the demographic you really want.
Right.
My children are they're in their mid-30s or so. Yeah, they don't own a television. They don't own a radio. Their entire world comes through this screen.
Right.
Now, more and more people are severing. But it won't take all of them to make it go. I might close on this point with New York. It's very topical. So the cost of rebuilding the infrastructure, just simply getting New York back to where it was before Sandy, has got to be in billions and billions. And the cost of making New York, defensible is even more.
Sure.
This is what I think is going to happen. And this is the 20% thing.
Sure.
First of all, Wall Street will go, you know what? I can't afford to have a dealing room. I can't take the risk of being down for 2 days or 3 or a week. I can't afford the risk of not having my staff be able to come in. I can't afford the risk of a dealing room not working. We have to move somewhere that is less vulnerable. So I could see Wall Street becoming a ghost. Even the New York Stock Exchange itself has to have this discussion. Now, you just go uptown. Yeah, so Madison Avenue is thinking, God, can we afford to be out for a week or so? And by the way, we're all living around here, can we afford to pay the new taxes that we're going to have to pay?
Right. Which are inevitably coming.
Who's going to move? The most mobile, the smartest people, the people who make the city, who are the center of the city. They may leave a token, something, Goldman Sachs may still have a bit of an office, on Wall Street, but most of the operation will leave. And most of the people who are smart enough will leave. It won't take more than, I use the word 20% because in the tipping point, when you get to about 15% adopting the new, that's the tipping point.
Sure.
So 20 is the far end of what we know. If you have a trend, so once you get up to about 15% fast, you've got momentum and the system will go. So somewhere between 15 and 20, you only got to have most of Wall Street go and a few other of that part of New York leave. And you'll never be able to pay the rest of the city will never be able to pay the taxes.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and that's why I've really encouraged our readers to pick up your book. The name of the book is "You Don't Need a Job." And Robert, I really thank you for your time this morning, and for those who haven't done so, go get it on Amazon. You'll be glad you did. And Robert, you're coming out with several other ebooks as well. Just closing real quick. Give us a preview of what else is coming.
Just as the guy is drilling down, I just published "You Don't Need a Banker," and that'll be available on Wednesday. And that's going to talk about crowdfunding, and again back to the old rules of banking, which are based on your reputation and your network, and how all the new tools that are coming out are really using the old ideas of how banking always was before we made it into mech banking, a formulaic process. And hopefully at Christmas, I know you're part of the same movement, you look tremendously healthy. I'm producing You Don't Need a Doctor. Now,
Right.
of course you need a doctor. If you're in a car accident, you need a doctor. You need a doctor for all sorts of things, but not to keep you healthy and not to prevent you from getting chronic illness.
Sure.
And then in the new year, I'm offering You Don't Need a Teacher. And we're going to explore the whole issue of, do you have to get a credential? Do you have to spend, $100,000 to go to university to be educated? And why not? And what could you do that might be better for you? And then later on, I'm dealing with, you don't need an office, you don't need a stockbroker. And later on, I'll do deeper books about what real parenting is all about. And my last book in the series will be A Fractal History of the World.
Oh, wow.
I will go through the great changes in society from hunter-gatherer to agriculture to the Reformation to the Industrial Revolution to now, and show the fractal pattern of all these changes. And then that gives you a sense, now you have a map where you've come from. This has happened before. Why do these things happen? And what are the best choices I can make now? That'll be the point of the last book in the series.
Wow. Well, that's pretty ambitious. We're really looking forward to it. And Robert, I really appreciate your time this morning, and I hope you get your house all finished.
Thank you very much, Coley.
All right. Thanks a lot.